Hare Om Namaha. Having spent my adolescent years in Wisconsin, I had plenty of experience with snow. It is a very cold and snowy state in the winter months, and I had plenty of experience to pick up snowfall patterns. One of these was a counterintuitive tendency demonstrated by incoming storms. The really large snowstorms, the ones that eventually dropped many feet of snow, almost always started off very light for the first hour or two. However, when heavy, wet snow fell at the beginning of an incoming storm, it almost always petered out, only dropping a few inches of the wet stuff on the ground. Analogously, ISKCON history records shocking revelations exposing the illegitimacy and pretensions of the 11 great pretenders, the Zonal Ācārya era, to have entered the collective consciousness of the rank-and-file Hare Krishna devotees as only drips and drabs in the beginning years. These eventually coalesced and snowballed into an avalanche, but it took quite a long time, years. Time changes things, but sometimes it changes things very slowly. And then it doesn't. In our ongoing review of 11 Naked Emperors, henceforward using the acronym ENE, in this review by the book written by Henry Doktorski, we now reach chapter 10. It's a bit of a tough read. It is a bridge chapter. There's no falsity in its recollection of what went down in the incipient years, 1980 and 1981 mostly, in which the deviations and egregious actions of the quote-unquote new gurus were initially exposed. At the same time, the account of this chapter in it does not read smoothly. The story jumps at a number of points. It takes on a number of threads and tries to effectively mesh them, but that proved to be a tough task. It does its best to accomplish the meld, but comes up short. Nevertheless, chapter 10 is helpful, no doubt about that. I'm not going to delve into all of the threads brought forth in that chapter, but I shall share my knowledge, realization, and intelligence with you relative to what I consider its essentials. I'm not criticized, but I am mentioned often in the chapter. One of the ways I am discussed in it is very obvious, but that vantage point will not be explored here in my presentation today. My contribution to exposing the Zonal Ācārya pretension during those incipient years of my whistleblowing, which is every year since then. It was in the late 70s and early 80s, and I acted in a certain way. Namely, I worked behind the scenes. There's no need for the listeners and readers of this podcast to be brought into any kind of granular account of my personal life during that subset of the air quotes ISKCON saga, although chapter 10 does touch upon it to some extent. You either get my drift or you don't. Either way, that should not have any effect on the transcendental benefit you can gain herein. The only potential blemish by Doktorski in this bridge chapter is its reproduction of an exchange in West Bengal, a long diatribe from Swami B.R. Sridhar relative to the early difficulties in so-called ISKCON. This diatribe was precipitated by one of its new gurus, Rāmeśvara, who approached him having lost faith in the grandiose worship demanded of all 11 of the great pretenders, himself included. He wanted to stop pretending, and he tried to do so. Although I am going to criticize him in this review today, he still deserves positive acknowledgement for having made an effort to stop taking that ridiculous Mahabhagavat worship. He did this before any of the others then followed his lead. He also was the only one of the 11 that did not concoct an elevated title for himself, such as Bhaktipad. Even one of them called himself Vishnupad. So he deserves credit for that also. Rāmeśvara is a central figure throughout Chapter 10. He approached Swami B.R. Sridhar for advice and relief, which means he went from the fire pan into the fire by doing so. Once again, catchy tropes from the Navadvip Mahant disguise the irrefutable fact that his advice in 1978 to the GBC was integral to the Ācārya Hoax, which was implemented that year. Now, I'm choosing not to reproduce any of that exchange. If you have the correct perspective of how much damage that Bengali Gaudiya Mutt leader did to Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's movement, you will not be impacted by reading the exchange, but I still choose not to facilitate it. The contradictions and hypocrisy of all of his flowery advice in the exchange is reprehensible, but it can be intoxicating also. The first transformation of the Zonal Ācārya era could never have gotten liftoff without his input, and now, in the early 80s, the chickens were coming home to roost. The nihilistic seeds of its own destruction already were in so-called ISKCON in the late 70s. In no small measure, and quite possibly by intention, they were planted by Swami B.R. Sridhar. Yet Western Guru, as Rāmeśvara is sometimes called in this chapter, ironically goes to the man who did that to us for even more advice. The gerund of his words being intoxicating is applicable to the extent that a reader of Chapter 10, particularly one with a poor fund of knowledge, could become bamboozled by imbibing what only appears to be sage advice. If you know what is what, then E&E relating this exchange, with all of its syrupy slogans, is not foreboding, but instead is a recording of historical exchange that few even know about to this day. So it's got value there. Doktorski, as we've pointed out repeatedly, was and is a first-class investigator. He has discovered an account of this meeting in Bengal between Rāmeśvara and Swami B.R. Sridhar and chose to bring it to our attention. It is not well known. Western Guru was clearly bewildered, and he became further bewildered after soaking up even more nescience from Navadvip. He did not get what he was seeking, at least not in the long run. We find the following excerpt from a Prabhupada purport in Chapter 10. Quote, "Unfortunately, when the Acharya disappears, rogues and non-devotees take advantage and immediately begin to introduce unauthorized principles. The Acharya, the authorized representative of the Supreme Lord, establishes these principles, but when he disappears, things once again become disordered," unquote. This well-known excerpt from Chaitanya Charitamrita is reproduced by E&E in this chapter, chapter 10, and rightfully so. Although the BBT editors decided otherwise, I would have chosen to capitalize Acārya with a capital A at the beginning because the excerpt only refers to an Uttama Adhikari successor in the line. Only he can establish the real principles of spiritual life in human society. Things became very disordered after his divine grace departed, and almost every devotee can see that now. However, in the early 80s, hardly anyone saw it, although your author was an exception to that rule of cult blindness. The unauthorized principles established by the first transformation were mind-boggling, but few knew that Prabhupada had nothing to do with it. You cannot pin it on him. This has been established as an irrefutable fact by now, although those who fell away do not recognize it. They blame him. Prabhupada did not appoint a successor, nor did he appoint gurus. He spoke on the principle of regular guru, which means a madhyam who has received the order to be an initiating spiritual master. But he did not recognize any of his own men as guru. Chapter 10 discusses some early fallout after knowledge of the inevitable personal anomalies, anachronisms, and fall-downs began to very slowly, but what proved to be irreversibly, filter into the collective consciousness of the devotees. However, in the early 80s, it was not a stone-cold metaphysical lock that this momentum of exposure was irreversible, although it is certainly irreversible today. E&E introduces pointed excerpts in this chapter, so let us reproduce two of those and discuss them. Remember, they're valid because they apply to the situation in so-called ISKCON in the early 80s. Quote, self-made guru cannot be guru. He must be authorized by the bona fide guru. Then he's guru. This is the fact. Nobody can be self-made anything. A medical practitioner, he cannot become self-made that, I've studied all the medical books in my home. No. Have you gone to the medical college and taken instruction from the bona fide teachers? Then, if you have got the certificate, then you are a medical practitioner. Similarly, bona fide guru means he must be authorized by the superior guru, unquote. The right interpretation is this. The ultimate bona fide guru is non-different from the superior guru referenced in this excerpt, and he is non-different from His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada in the context of his statement here. Did any of the 11 Ritviks receive any kind of certification from Prabhupada as to their alleged guru status? They did not. There was no appointment of gurus, what to speak of 11 successors. There was no such recognition. The 11 were only appointed as Ritviks, which was no big thing, because there had been Ritviks serving in that formal and ceremonial capacity since 1970. Prabhupada never recognized any of them as regular gurus, what to speak of Uttama Adhikaris. If he recognized any of them as initiating spiritual masters, he would not have appointed them as merely Ritviks. The 11 parlayed their appointment as Ritviks into a covert appointment of initiating spiritual masters, and this was bogus. It was a false presupposition that was finally being revealed in the early 80s. Chapter 10 is all about that incipient exposure, which was the beginning of the end of the Zonal Ācārya scam, although few saw it as such. The author of E&E later received a Facebook message from Robert Grant concerning his, Rāmeśvara's, vacillating change of heart in connection to the, air quotes, ISKCON gurus during the early 80s. He had been read the Riot Act by one of the prominent and powerful female devotees at his Los Angeles headquarters after she listened to the quote-unquote appointment tape and discovered that there is no guru appointment on it. This shook him up. Rāmeśvara removed his opulent seat from the temple room, a good first step, obviously, and then busted himself down from Uttama Ācārya to Madhyama Ācārya. However, he was not a Madhyama Ācārya, since he was still heavily entangled in institutional anarthas. This is proven in his Facebook message to Doktorski, which is loaded with contradictions. We shall be detailing some of those here. Now, Rāmeśvara had significant local influence, but the other powers that be in so-called ISKCON at that time, namely most of the other so-called Mahabhagavats, although 3 others were being disciplined, decried his new realization. They convened an emergency meeting in Dallas to confront and threaten him. And now here's that Facebook message to Doktorski I just referenced. Quote, "The GBC convened an emergency meeting in Dallas where they voted to excommunicate me for heresy against the gurus. I tried my best to convince the others to step back, or at least let me step back, from the concept that simply by Srila Prabhupada's order for us to give diksha, that automatically elevated us to a level that none of us were on. Unfortunately, I was not able to convince them. I debated them for a day, but the outcome had already been fixed. They had already voted and written the excommunication letter before I even arrived. They said withdrawing my papers wouldn't be enough. They insisted that I write a new paper retracting everything I had previously said. So I went back to my writing team and asked that we find the most extreme, elevated statements about the exalted pure devotees who appear from the spiritual world as bona fide gurus, thinking that maybe when they read about the gurus seeing Krishna in Vrindavan, it would embarrass them into finally stepping back. Instead, they praised the new paper, saying it was the greatest thing I had ever written. And that's when I started to fall away, having lost faith in the ISKCON gurus and the GBC that endorsed them. They ordered me to live as a hypocrite. That loss of faith gradually affected my sadhana, and I became an easy victim of the illusory energy. It took many years to shake that off, and eventually I began crawling back to ISKCON. That was only possible because I never doubted Srila Prabhupada and his books, unquote. Decades after the zonal debacle, it's almost mind-numbing to see how deluded this man still is. Granted, for a brief time he came to his senses and stopped taking Uttama worship. That somewhat radical step deserves positive acknowledgement, and we've given him already that acknowledgement here earlier. Despite these positive steps, none of his position papers and actions actually produced anything tangible. Why they did not is practically self-evident in his Facebook message to Doktorski here, decades after the Zonal Ācārya Hoax cratered. He starts the message with a historical inaccuracy, viz., that he was excommunicated. Due to the fact that he capitulated to the GBC at the Dallas conclave, he was only threatened with excommunication. He claims that he tried his best. His best? No. There are many steps that he could have taken, which would have been far better than his capitulation to the pressure they put on him. For starters, he could have accepted the excommunication. That would have been the obvious right move, but he was not courageous enough to take it. Had he done so, he could have made strong propaganda against the hoax, having accrued street cred in doing so because he accepted ostracism. Now, you may counter this by imagining that they would have assassinated him if he did that. Is that so? Would they actually have been so immersed in their so-called allegedly untouchable status as to have ordered the murder of one of their own, and without drastic repercussions? If he was excommunicated and making propaganda against them, combined with shastric evidence and a clear ethical stance, law enforcement and the press would have jumped all over any such assassination or assassination attempt. At any rate, such an attempt probably would have only amounted to, at most, an unsuccessful effort. He had dedicated disciples. Not all of them would have left him. At least half would have stayed with him, and some of them were enforcers and hatchet men. He would have been well protected, and he would not have been hurting for income from his many disciples in order to maintain himself in his preaching. The path was wide open for him to have exposed the whole thing at an early stage. If he had done so, the rest of the movement would have been spared much grief. Remember, the zonal imposition dragged on for many years after this Dallas incident recounted in Grant's Facebook message. He mixes in again the major misconception that Prabhupada ordered the 11 great pretenders to be initiating spiritual masters. He most certainly did not. None of them received that order. If any of them had individually received that order from Prabhupada, that disciple would have let it be known just how and when and under what circumstances he received it. None of them did that. Why? Because none of them received it. Yet, in this much later, by decades, message to Doktorski, Rāmeśvara is stating that they were ordered to give Diksha as an initiating spiritual master. The 11 were only appointed as Ritviks, nothing more. Fortunately, this fact is starting to become common knowledge now, and people are catching on. The accurate interpretation of the reality in the late 70s will continue to expand until almost everyone finally knows it and realizes it. And when that transpires, it will contribute to critical mass, which has not yet been attained. And when critical mass is attained, the current, air quotes, ISKCON make show will be rejected and railed against in a way which will accelerate until it no longer has any influence in the world. And that is sorely wanted. Rāmeśvara's current mentality, as demonstrated in this Facebook message reproduced in E&E and herein being analyzed, the current mentality will not help us much. He's still bewitched. He claims that it was wrong for the 11 to take Uttama worship. However, in the same sentence, he makes the false statement that Prabhupada appointed them as initiating spiritual masters. When you multiply a positive number by a negative number, guess what? You get a greater negative result. Rāmeśvara is still part of the old guard, and he's not part of the solution. It is doubtful that he will ever become part of the solution. He then says that in the Dallas conclave, they ordered him to retract his previous position paper, which had urged the rest of them to follow his lead and act as Madhyam Udhikaris or regular gurus. Well, he wasn't one. So that paper had no potency or spiritual sequence. He was no longer a Sahajya, but now he moved up to Mishra Bhakta, and very mixed within his own compromised intelligence. Returning to those early 80s at the Dallas conclave, so what does he do? By his own admission, he accepts their order and authorizes a new position paper taking an opposite tack glorifying the Guru as Uttama. He spews out all kinds of adulation about the inviolable status of every Guru because they are all on the highest platform of realization and purity. And he expected this to work? Incomprehensible. Instead, they all praised his new position paper, and he was astounded by that? Of course that would be their reaction. All of those men were absorbed in self-apotheosis. They were constantly surrounded by sycophants and yes-men. They were glorified by pranam mantras and worshipped by adoring fools in front of open deities while sitting on high, lavish seats. And they were, in effect, forcing him to once again do the same thing under threat of cult ostracism. It would have been a badge of honor for him to have accepted excommunication from so-called ISKCON if he would have seen it for what it was, that it was a gift offered by Paramatma to him. The mere fact that he thought going so extreme in his paper would, somehow or other, be effective, demonstrates that this man did not understand even basic cause and effect. Tattvamasi. We then proceed to the end of his message. He writes, quote, "That's when I started to fall away, having lost faith in the ISKCON gurus and the GBC that endorsed them," unquote. This term, fall away, in his mind, is nothing more than a synonym for falling down. That is proven by the context of his final paragraph in the Facebook message. He still mixes up his capitulation with justifiable doubts that he could not eradicate. Doubt can be either a product of sinful actions or it can be a facet of intelligence. In this case, back in the early 80s, when applied to air quotes ISKCON gurus, it was the latter. The colossal hoax of the Zonal Ācārya era was Atipapam, and all those entangled in it individually suffered sinful reactions. Big time. One of them got beheaded. One of them got cut in half in an automobile accident. Everyone should have doubted what the vitiated GBC was doing at that time. Rāmeśvara doubted, but he could not act upon that intelligence, so he capitulated. As his compromised Facebook message closes, he writes, quote, "It took many years to shake that off, and eventually I began crawling back to ISKCON. That was only possible because I never doubted Srila Prabhupada and his books," unquote. Crawling back to what? ISKCON no longer existed when he came crawling back. It had been converted into a doppelganger, taken over and killed by so-called ISKCON. Although somewhat subtle and only communicated between the lines, he is covertly, or perhaps subconsciously, urging all those who left the death cult to return to it now that it has repudiated the Zonal Ācārya hoax, which he helped implement in the early 80s. This Facebook message from Rāmeśvara to Henry Doktorski was transmitted on June 22nd, 2022. The lack of self-awareness and even basic intelligence in it is staggering. The man had over 40 years to ponder what went down and why, and how he was entangled in it. But he had practically learned nothing. Did he actually make any contribution to the zonal debacle eventually cratering? You can't light a fire by pouring water on it. He simply produced smoke during that incipient stage of its exposure, but no real light. His initial steps to rectify the situation bore no fruit, because he was still too compromised. Fire serves, but smoke disturbs. He was not at all at the forefront of combating the first transformation. E goes on to explore how others in the early 80s began to doubt the hoax of the Uttama Ācārya worship program. Quote, Satsvarūpa, like Rāmeśvara, also had doubts about his own purity and requested the GBC in 1982 to allow him to reduce his worship. He was also voted down. Bahudak Das remembered, in Mayapur, 1982, Satsvarūpa requested to reduce his worship. The GBC refused him. They were very angry about it. It was the first breakthrough that one of the 11 gurus wanted to come down to a reasonable level, and the other acharyas said no. 3 Zonal Ācāryas, Tamal Krishna, Rāmeśvara, and Satsvarūpa, realized that they had been cheating the society by pretending to be Uttama Adhikaris, and they expressed doubts about their legitimacy. But all 3, under mounting pressure from the other zonals, recanted and once again mounted their thrones and began enjoying the extravagant worship unbefitting their status as show-bottle pure devotees. Why were they forced back into pretending to be acharyas? Some say that the 11 had lied and cheated to gain their counterfeit positions as so-called Uttama Adhikari Diksha gurus. Therefore, they could not allow even one member to follow his conscience, protest the charade, and abandon the make show, unquote. Some of the rank and file were beginning to doubt at that time, but it was a very slow process in the early 80s. The first transformation was still believed in by the majority of, air quotes, ISKCON devotees, especially the new people. Nothing like the internet had yet emerged. Word spread, but not quickly. Hangsadutta could be added to this 3-man list of zonals who expressed doubt about their opulent worship, which culminated in his de facto excommunication in May of 1983. His previous suspension as initiating guru had been earlier reversed by the vitiated GBC, but his personal shenanigans had continued unabated, especially his heavy-duty drinking. Ocean's 11 began to segue into damage control in the early 80s. This was quite ironic, considering their previous triumphalist attitude after crushing the malcontents at Ramanreti in early February of 1979. The best defense is a good offense, as the saying goes. As such, the pillar of the zonal scam was the assumed mandate of its great men, the 11 former Ritviks, to be worshipped as Sakshat Hari. That had to be kept in place. This idea that the guru must be an Uttama Adhikari required the worship program to continue, although all of them were light years away from such eligibility. Yet according to their scheme implemented in the late spring of 1978, they had to be seen as such by their devotees. There was not enough resistance in the early 80s in order for the majority of the zonals to consider changing their worship protocol. And also, obviously, they got off on it big time. Those 4 who doubted were not united, but the rest were still united against them in order to keep it in place. And thus they were able to beat back this incipient attack against the pillar of their pretension. E adequately points all of this out in Chapter 10. Of course they had lied and cheated in order to gain false statuses as Uttama Adhikari gurus, a monopoly which they still held in the very early 80s. However, as we shall explore next month, they were soon forced to expand their number. Also, the backing of their Uttama scheme by Swami B.R. Sridhar, despite the fact that he was essential to formulating and forming it in 1978, was now in the early 80s on shaky ground. In particular, he was criticizing actions that the GBC had taken against Jayatirtha, culminating in its schism with him in the spring of 1982, its schism with Swami B.R. Sridhar. To say that this split negatively impacted the zonal scheme in a profound way is a bridge too far. The scheme remained strong because the majority of the movement had fully invested in it for years. And there was another factor. Those who had not bought into it were no longer part of so-called ISKCON. They were outside the walls of the cult, and their influence was non-existent within it. Such was the case with Swami B.R. Sridhar by that time also. The schism with him was the right political move within the institution's paradigm. It did not harm the pretension, which was still considered wrongly to be Prabhupada's will. However, doubts expressed by 4 of their great men, and especially the fall downs of some stalwarts amongst the 11, required a new explanation in order to continue legitimizing the zonal scheme. Other first and second echelon sannyasis and commissioners wanted a slice of the initiating pie. They were chomping at the bit for it. The remaining zonals no longer could rely upon the so-called appointment tape. Word that this recording did not actually establish the 11 as appointed spiritual masters by Prabhupada, that word was spreading. Such an unsound source of legitimacy would not be able to hold up much longer because Prabhupada did not appoint them. E&E delves into this conundrum as follows, quote, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada had not appointed 11 acharyas to succeed him in his absence, and the GBC eventually admitted it. So they changed their story. They said the 11 acharyas were appointed by the GBC, and the GBC was, quote-unquote, the same as Prabhupada. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada had allegedly said, quote-unquote, ISKCON is my body, and he did write in his will, quote, the governing body commission, GBC, will be the ultimate managing authority of the entire International Society for Krishna Consciousness, unquote. Therefore, the 11 acharyas claimed becoming guru by a vote of confidence from the GBC was the same as if Prabhupada had personally ordered a disciple, you become guru. The GBC resolved, quote, the GBC is the supreme authority in the management of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and the direct manifestation of His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, unquote. Paranjan recollected, sometimes gurus will actually admit that the alleged appointment tape of May 28th is weak evidence that they have been appointed. Hridayananda Swami later began to contradict the original GBC statement that the evidence was in the May 28th, 1977 tape. He began to argue that Srila Prabhupada's will had named the GBC as, quote, the ultimate managers of ISKCON, unquote. Actually, it was Kirtanananda who initially came up with this rationalization. It did not establish a new transformation. The first transformation of the zonal era continued. Although it did not establish a new transformation, it continued to buy time for them, exposing the fact that Prabhupada did not directly appoint them got manipulated into another misinterpretation, namely that his governing body commission, allegedly non-different from him, appointed them. It did so, obviously. However, they made more out of it than originally designed, and this was the basis of the new transitive theory. The air quotes ISKCON transitive theory is that Prabhupada equals ISKCON, and the will of ISKCON is non-different from the GBC. This simplistic formula satisfied the chelas if and when they finally began to hear about the so-called appointment tape being no such thing. Of course, at that time, no one had access to the letters. Earlier in Chapter 10, the following well-known excerpt, well-known now by most of us, from one of the letters was reproduced. This letter was sent to Hangsaduta just days after Prabhupada suspended the governing body commission. It reads as follows. On April 11th, 1972, "What will happen when I am not here? Shall everything be spoiled by GBC?" Unquote. The GBC was busted down, and Prabhupada transferred all the power back to the temple presidents, where it originally resided before the creation of the GBC. Your host speaker has discussed this incident in detail in a number of articles, videos, and other media formats. It had been buried, but it was resurrected mostly by myself. That centralization scheme of 1972 was the seed of deviation that eventually sprouted into a full-blown mutiny and takeover by the Ācārya board of the GBC in 1978. It proves, beyond doubt, that the GBC was never non-different from His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. It's a myth that it ever was. It's also a myth that it ever had or has a so-called automatic corrective mechanism intrinsic to or inherent in it. Prabhupada never officially ordered any of his disciples to become an initiating spiritual master. Show me where he did this. No one can show any such thing, because such a statement of appointment or recognition by him does not exist. He only appointed Ritviks in July of 1977. He never appointed a successor, and he did not appoint any regular gurus either. He briefly mentioned the principle of regular guru on the so-called appointment tape, but no names were attached to that. To link the May 28th discussion of the regular guru to the appointment of Ritviks well over a month later is to create an illusion only. That illusion was the basis of the Zonal Ācārya imposition, and people are catching on. They will continue to realize this fact. That illusion, that cheating, that massive institutional mendacity was then parlayed into the Uttama worship of 11 Sahajiyas movement-wide beginning in April of 1978, when it was implemented by force almost everywhere in the world. Now, as far as the zonal era was concerned, in the early 80s, things were beginning to break down. Doubts were in the ascendant, but this was still only applicable to a few devotees. It was still the minority report. To staunch that developing situation, some kind of nifty explanation had to be mined from the ocean of nescience. That came in the form of the above-mentioned rationalization, courtesy of Kirtanananda, one of the taproots of the Uttama scheme. It allowed so-called ISKCON to kick the can down the road and bought the major players, those integral to the massive deviation, more time. Chapter 10 discusses an incipient counter-momentum, which was not at all strong in 1981 and 82, slowly seeping its way into the collective consciousness of Prabhupada's sincere and serious disciples. As mentioned, Chapter 10 is a bridge chapter. It's a recollection of the facts surrounding the beginning of the breakdown of the Zonal Ācārya imposition. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. The first transformation of this make-show was the Zonal Ācārya imposition. It took time for it to crater, and the die was not cast with certainty until the early 80s. Rome did not fall in a day, and during the heyday of its decadence, virtually none of its citizens could envision that a small and persecuted cult would eventually replace emperor worship. Rome was actually destroyed from within, and so-called ISKCON was also in the incipient stage of being destroyed from within during the early 80s. The tune, the attractive tune, the enchanting tune of its fan was unplugged, but the fan was still spinning. The tune of its enchantment was still being heard, but the music was slowing. Sadeva Samya